Hey there, and welcome to Dark Creaky TV. If you're new, hit that subscribe button for spine-tingling Reddit creepypasta stories that are perfect for a night of chilling thrills. Don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and let's get into tonight's stories. I ordered Ouija board from Rothschild's website on the deep web. It taught me how to sell my should and become wealthy. I never thought I'd find myself on the deep web, let alone browsing Rothschild's website. It was one of those nights where sleep seemed like a distant dream, and the promise of the internet's darkest corners pulled me in like a moth to a flame. I had heard whispers about this site, rumoured to hold secrets beyond imagination, knowledge that could unlock the deepest desires of the human heart. But what I found was something far more sinister. The website was minimalist, almost too ordinary. A plain black background with white text, no flashy graphics or fancy designs, just a simple list of items, each one more bizarre than the last. There were artifacts, strange tomes written in languages I couldn't even begin to recognize. And then there was the Ouija board. Its description was what caught my attention. Communicate with the other side, discover secrets untold, wealth and power at your fingertips. At the time, I was broke, drowning in student loans, and desperate for any way out. That promise of wealth and power was irresistible. Without thinking twice, I clicked add to cart. It felt like a joke at first, a creepy novelty to show my friends. I mean, a Ouija board that teaches you how to get rich. It was laughable. The payment process was anything but ordinary. Bitcoin, of course. Once the transaction went through, I received an email completely devoid of any sender information, just a message. Your request has been processed. Await the arrival of your path. 2 weeks later, the package arrived. It was an unmarked, nondescript box, heavier than I expected. Inside, nestled in layers of dusty, crumbling paper, was the Ouija board. It was old, far older than it looked online. The planchette was a small, carved piece of wood, polished smooth by countless hands over decades, maybe centuries. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I set up the board on my coffee table. The flickering light of a few candles casting shadows that danced eerily around my living room. I placed my fingers on the planchette, half expecting to feel nothing. I'd never really believed in the supernatural, but as soon as I whispered my question, how do I gain wealth? The planchette moved with a force that made my heart skip a beat. The board spelled out words at a dizzying speed. Offer what you value most. Wealth follows the worthy. I laughed it off, trying to convince myself that it was my subconscious desire for money driving the planchette. Still, there was something unnerving about it. What did I value most? My soul? My freedom? I had always thought that stuff was pure fantasy, but that night I had a dream, or maybe it was a nightmare. I was standing in an endless void, darkness pressing in from all sides, and there was a figure, a man, tall and thin, with eyes that glowed like embers. He told me he could grant me what I sought, but I had to give him something in return. His voice was a whisper, yet it filled my head, drowning out all other thoughts. When I woke up, I was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. It was just a dream, I told myself, but as I glanced around my apartment, something felt different. There was a sense of unease that hadn't been there before, a feeling of being watched. Days turned into weeks, and strange things started happening. Small at first, a book falling off the shelf, lights flickering, the temperature dropping unexpectedly. But soon, it escalated. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, and I'd hear whispers when I was alone, unintelligible, yet chilling. It was like the darkness from my dream had seeped into my reality. I tried to ignore it, to pretend that everything was normal, but deep down, I knew I was in over my head. The Ouija board had opened a door, and something had come through. Something that wouldn't leave until I fulfilled my end of the bargain. It wasn't until I lost my job that I really started to panic. I had been doing well. My boss had even mentioned a promotion. Then, out of nowhere, they fired me, citing budget cuts. It was the final straw, the push I needed to go back to the board. Desperation has a way of making you do things you wouldn't normally consider. I set the board up again, my hands shaking, my mind racing with fear and anticipation. "What do you want from me?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The planchette moved instantly, as if it had been waiting for me. Commitment. It was then that I realized the gravity of what I was dealing with. This wasn't some game or internet prank. The board, the dream, the figure, they were all part of something much darker, something beyond my comprehension. And as much as I wanted to run, I knew I couldn't escape. The board had chosen me, and now I had to decide how far I was willing to go to fulfill my desires. I spent that night contemplating my options. What did commitment mean? My thoughts drifted back to the dream, to the figure who promised wealth in exchange for something precious. The whispers in the shadows grew louder, more insistent, as if urging me to take the plunge. Sleep was elusive. I lay awake, the weight of my decision pressing down on me like a physical force. I knew I had to choose soon. Either give in to whatever the board demanded, or face the consequences of ignoring its call. As the sun began to rise, casting its pale light through my window, I made up my mind. I would use the board one last time, ask it for guidance, and see where it led me. I had nothing to lose, and maybe, just maybe, everything to gain. But little did I know, the journey I was about to embark on would take me to the darkest depths of my soul and beyond. The decision to use the Ouija board again was not one I took lightly. It felt like I was on the brink of something monumental, a precipice of power and madness, and there was no turning back now. I cleared my living room, placing the board on the floor and surrounding it with candles, their flickering flames casting long, menacing shadows across the walls. I sat there for what felt like hours, the room silent except for the ticking of the clock, my fingers hovering above the planchette. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The air felt heavy, thick with anticipation. Finally, I placed my fingers on the planchette and asked, "What do you need from me for wealth?" The planchette moved slowly at first, then faster, with a purpose that sent chills down my spine. It spelled out an offering of pain, a sacrifice. I pulled my hands back, my mind racing. A sacrifice? What kind of sacrifice? My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was metaphorical, like sacrificing my comfort zone or facing my fears. But deep down, I knew the board meant something much more sinister. Determined to understand, I returned my fingers to the planchette. "What sacrifice?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Again the planchette moved, its message chilling. A life for a life. Wealth demands suffering. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. A life for a life? I recoiled at the thought, the very idea sending a jolt of terror through me. I had wanted wealth, but not like this. Not at the cost of someone's life. I pushed the board away, disgusted, my mind a whirl of confusion and fear. How could I even consider such a thing? This was insane, evil. I decided then and there to leave it alone, to bury the board and forget this whole nightmare. But as with all things touched by darkness, it wasn't that simple. The nightmares came back, worse than before. Each night, I was haunted by visions of that tall, thin figure, his glowing eyes boring into my soul. He showed me images of riches beyond my wildest dreams, mansions, cars, power, but always there was a price. The visions grew more vivid, more enticing, and yet horrifying in their clarity. By day, I couldn't escape the feeling of being watched. Every creak, every shadow seemed alive with malice. I began losing track of time, days bleeding into nights. My world narrowed to the confines of my apartment. The board, a constant, sinister presence in the corner of my eye. In a desperate bid to rid myself of its influence, I tried to get rid of the board. I wrapped it in cloth and buried it deep in a nearby forest, hoping to leave it behind. For a brief moment I felt relief, as if I'd severed a cord tying me to the dark promises it held. But when I returned home, the board was there, waiting, as if it had never left. I nearly screamed, my mind unable to process the impossibility of it. I was trapped in its web, bound by unseen forces that tightened with every breath. I sought help from the few friends I had left, but they dismissed my stories as stress-induced delusions. Alone, I began researching ways to break whatever hold the board had over me, diving into forums and obscure books that only served to deepen my paranoia. The turning point came one night when the whispers became voices, distinct and demanding. They spoke of blood, of bonds sealed in agony and despair. The air grew cold, and I felt a presence unseen but suffocatingly close. I knew then that I couldn't ignore it any longer. The board had woven itself into the fabric of my life, and the only way out was through the path it offered. Desperation clouded my judgment, blurring the line between right and wrong. The thought of wealth, of escaping my debts and struggles, became a siren call I couldn't resist. It promised a future where I was no longer a prisoner of my circumstances, where I had the power to change everything. One night, after hours of restless pacing, I succumbed. I sat before the board, a mix of fear and determination coursing through me. My hands shook as I touched the planchette, the candles flickering wildly in the growing darkness. "I accept," I said, my voice trembling yet resolute. "I accept your terms." The air crackled with energy, and the planchette flew across the board, spelling out a single word: prepare. Prepare for what? The question loomed large in my mind as the room plunged into shadow, the candles extinguished by an unseen hand. I was left alone, sitting in the dark, with the weight of my decision pressing down on me. As I sat there, the realization of what I had agreed to sank in. I had made a pact, a binding promise to something beyond my understanding, and now, whatever was on the other side of that Ouija board was coming to collect its due. In that moment, I understood the true cost of what I sought. Wealth was within reach, but the path to it was paved with horrors I couldn't yet comprehend, and I was powerless to stop it. The days after my acceptance were a blur of fear and anticipation. I expected immediate changes, some sign that the pact had been acknowledged, but instead there was only silence, a foreboding quiet that pressed on my sanity like a vice. The dreams grew more vivid, more sinister. They began as twisted echoes of my reality, familiar places warped into nightmarish versions of themselves. My apartment was transformed into a labyrinth of endless hallways and locked doors, each step taking me deeper into the unknown. I could feel the presence of the tall figure, his eyes burning with a hunger I couldn't comprehend. But it wasn't just the dreams. Strange occurrences plagued my waking hours. Objects moved on their own, disappearing only to reappear in different rooms. Mirrors reflected not my image, but scenes of suffering and despair. Faces twisted in agony, reaching out from the glass as if pleading for release. I was on edge, jumping at shadows, every creak and groan of the apartment magnified 1,000-fold. I tried to distract myself, to forget the deal I had made, but the board was always there, a constant reminder of the path I had chosen. One evening, as I sat staring at the board, trying to gather the courage to ask it what came next, the power went out. The apartment was plunged into darkness, the air growing cold and still. I fumbled for my phone, using its dim light to navigate through the room. Suddenly, a voice whispered from the shadows, clear and commanding. "The time has come." My heart raced as I spun around, trying to locate the source. The darkness seemed alive, pulsing with energy that I could feel vibrating through my bones. The candles on the table flared to life, casting the room in a flickering orange glow. The Ouija board, unbidden, slid to the center of the table. The planchette moved with a speed and force that was both mesmerizing and terrifying, spelling out a series of words that chilled me to my core. Prepare the offering. The pact is sealed. It was real. All of it was real. The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave, crashing over the fragile barriers of denial I had erected. I knew then that the whispers, the dreams, the shadows, they were all leading to this moment. But what was the offering? The planchette moved again, more deliberately this time, spelling out a name I knew well, my friend, Sarah. We had grown up together, shared secrets, and been there for each other through thick and thin. The thought of hurting her was unthinkable, yet the board had spoken. I felt sick to my stomach, the weight of my decision crushing me. How could I betray someone I cared about so deeply? But the whispers in the dark left no room for doubt or refusal. Days passed in a haze of dread and guilt. I withdrew from everyone, terrified of the monster I was becoming. Sarah reached out, concerned, but I couldn't face her. Every time I looked into her eyes, I saw the shadow of what I was planning, and it tore me apart. Desperation led me back to the deep web, searching for any way to undo the pact, to escape the grasp of whatever force I had unleashed, but every avenue closed in on itself, leading back to one inescapable truth: the only way out was through. I was trapped, my soul ensnared by forces beyond my comprehension. Each night I wrestled with my conscience, the pull of the board growing stronger, its demands more insistent. It was as if the board itself was alive, its hunger for the sacrifice a palpable force that twisted my thoughts and dreams. One night, unable to bear the weight of my guilt any longer, I called Sarah, asking her to meet me at our favourite spot in the park. My hands shook as I clutched the phone, my voice barely recognisable even to myself. As I waited for her, the board's whispers grew louder, drowning out reason and morality. They promised riches, freedom from my burdens, a life unshackled by the chains of poverty and despair. All I had to do was offer up one life, one soul, and everything I had ever wanted would be mine. When Sarah arrived, her smile was like a knife twisting in my gut. She was so full of life, so trusting. As we talked, the weight of what I had to do became unbearable. A stone lodged in my chest. The park was empty, the night air crisp and silent, a perfect cover for the darkness lurking within me. I could feel the presence of the figure from my dreams, his eyes watching, waiting. The air hummed with energy, urging me forward. But as I looked at Sarah, I knew I couldn't do it. The thought of sacrificing her to some unknown force was abhorrent, a betrayal too great to bear. I stood frozen, torn between the demands of the board and the cries of my own conscience. In that moment of indecision, I heard the whispers again, but this time they were different. They spoke of choice, of the power to defy fate and forge my own path. I realized then that the board's power was not absolute, that I could break free if I was willing to pay the price. Summoning every ounce of courage, I told Sarah everything. The board, the pact, the sacrifice. I expected her to run, to call me insane and leave me to my fate. But she didn't. Instead, she listened, her expression shifting from disbelief to horror to something like understanding. Together, we resolved to fight back, to find a way to destroy the board and sever its hold over me. It wouldn't be easy, and the path ahead was fraught with danger. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. We had a plan, a way to confront the darkness and reclaim our lives. As we left the park, the figure from my dreams loomed in the shadows, his eyes burning with a promise of retribution. But I no longer feared him. I had chosen my path, and I would face whatever consequences came with it. I had been given a second chance, and I wasn't going to waste it. Together, Sarah and I would find a way to break the curse and end the nightmare once and for all. Sarah and I plunged into research with an intensity born of desperation. We scoured the internet for information, delving into forums, chat rooms, and obscure websites that seemed to pulse with hidden knowledge. Each discovery pulled us deeper into the occult underworld, where the board was just one piece of a much larger, darker puzzle. We learned of rituals and spells, methods to banish malevolent entities and break curses. But these weren't the easy, foolproof solutions we had hoped for. Each ritual carried its own risks, its own potential to backfire spectacularly. But we had no choice. The whispers grew more insistent with each passing day, the shadows lengthening and closing in around us. It was Sarah who found the ritual that seemed to hold the promise of liberation, a complex ceremony designed to sever ties with malevolent forces and render their artifacts powerless. It was old magic, written in symbols that seemed to shift and writhe on the page. But it was our best shot, our only chance to free ourselves from the board's grip. The ritual required preparation and a very particular set of ingredients. Candles made of black wax, salt harvested from the sea, and herbs that had to be gathered under the light of a waning moon. Most importantly, it required the presence of a willing witness, someone whose life was intertwined with the cursed individuals, a safeguard against the ritual's inherent dangers. With each passing day, the presence around us grew stronger. Lights flickered and died, plunging us into darkness. The whispers became voices, their words barely audible yet filled with menace. I felt the weight of unseen eyes upon me at all hours, watching, waiting. On the night of the ritual, the air was electric with anticipation and fear. Sarah and I gathered everything we needed and set up the ceremony in my apartment. The room was transformed. Candles arranged in a circle around the Ouija board, their flames flickering ominously. The air felt thick, almost viscous, as if the very atmosphere was resisting what we were about to do. I could sense the figure from my dreams, hovering just beyond the edge of perception, his presence a cold shadow that chilled me to the bone. We began by drawing a circle of salt around the board, an ancient protective measure meant to keep out any unwanted spirits. Sarah read aloud from the ritual book, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. I focused on the board, my mind filled with a single desperate hope that this would work, that we would be free. The candles flickered as Sarah's voice rose, the words of the ritual echoing through the room. The planchette on the board trembled, vibrating with an energy that seemed to pulse in time with my racing heart. The shadows around us thickened, growing darker and more oppressive. Suddenly, the planchette began to move on its own, spelling out a warning that sent a shiver of dread through me. "You cannot escape!" I fought the urge to run, forcing myself to stay within the circle, to trust in the ritual's power. Sarah continued chanting, her voice rising to a crescendo. The air shimmered, charged with a tension that crackled like static electricity. As the ritual reached its peak, a loud crack echoed through the room, and the shadows around us seemed to explode, swirling in a frenzy before dissipating into nothingness. The candles flared brilliantly before snuffing out, plunging us into darkness once more. For a moment, there was silence. Then, slowly, the room returned to normal. The oppressive weight that had hung over us lifted. I dared to hope that we had succeeded, that the board's hold on me was broken. But the relief was short-lived. The planchette began to move again, slowly and deliberately, spelling out a final chilling message. The pact remains. I felt a crushing despair settle over me, the realization that we hadn't ended it, hadn't severed the ties that bound me to the darkness. The board was still connected to me, its demands as unyielding as ever. Sarah and I stared at each other, fear mirrored in our eyes. We had failed. The board had won. But there was one last thing we could try. A final, desperate gambit that held its own dangers. We had read about a place, a location rumoured to be a nexus of supernatural energy, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where the barriers that held back the darkness were at their weakest. If we could reach it, perhaps we could perform a final ritual to sever the connection once and for all. It was a risky plan, fraught with uncertainties, but as the shadows in the room began to gather once more, I knew we had no choice. The board wouldn't let me go, not until it had what it wanted, and we were running out of time. Together, Sarah and I would make our way to the nexus, and there we would confront whatever awaited us. As we left the apartment, I felt the eyes of the figure watching, his presence lingering in the corners of my mind. But I pushed the fear aside, focusing on the hope that this journey would be our salvation. One way or another, I was determined to end the nightmare. The darkness had taken enough from me, and it was time to fight back with everything we had. The journey to the Nexus was long and perilous, our path illuminated only by the headlights of Sarah's car as we drove through the desolate landscape. It was an area miles outside of town, an abandoned lot surrounded by dense forest. The trees loomed over us like silent sentinels, their branches casting skeletal shadows across the ground. We arrived just before midnight, the air thick with anticipation. The place felt alive, pulsing with a dark energy that made my skin crawl. It was as if the very earth here breathed with the rhythm of the otherworldly forces that converged upon it. Sarah and I made our way through the woods, the path lit by the glow of our flashlights. The trees seemed to press in on us, their leaves whispering secrets carried by the wind. I felt the presence again, stronger now, as if it were part of the land itself, watching and waiting for our next move. The nexus was a clearing deep within the forest, a place where the natural world gave way to something far more ancient and powerful. At the center stood a stone altar, weathered by time and covered in strange symbols that seemed to writhe in the moonlight. We set up the ritual space, arranging the candles in a circle around the altar and spreading the herbs across its surface. The air was electric with anticipation, the shadows growing longer as we prepared to confront the darkness that had haunted me for so long. I took a deep breath and placed the Ouija board on the altar, the planchette already trembling in anticipation. Sarah began the ritual, her voice strong and unwavering as she recited the incantations we had memorized. The words seemed to hang in the air, vibrating with a power that felt ancient and unyielding. As Sarah spoke, I placed my fingers on the planchette, feeling the familiar coldness seep into my bones. The board began to move, slowly at first, then faster, its movements erratic and frantic. It spelled out warnings, threats, promises of doom that clawed at my resolve, but I refused to be swayed. I focused on the ritual, on the words and symbols that promised freedom. The air around us shimmered, the shadows pressing in as the world seemed to shift and buckle under the weight of the energies we had summoned. The figure from my dreams appeared, his form solidifying within the circle of candles. His eyes burned with a malevolent light, his presence an overwhelming force that threatened to crush me under its weight. He was taller than I remembered, his features sharper, more defined, as if he had drawn strength from my fear and despair. He spoke without words, his voice a whisper that echoed in my mind. "You cannot escape. The pact is eternal." But Sarah's voice cut through the darkness, strong and clear. She called upon the forces of light and protection, invoking the power of the nexus to banish the entity and sever the ties that bound me. The ground shook as the shadows writhed and twisted, the darkness coiling around the figure like a living thing. The candles flared brilliantly, casting their light into the void and pushing back against the encroaching night. I focused all my will on the board, the words of the ritual filling my mind, my soul. I could feel the connection weakening, the ties that bound me fraying under the onslaught of our combined will. The figure screamed, a sound that pierced the air and drove into my very being. But I held firm, refusing to let it break me. Sarah continued her chant, her voice rising in intensity as the light around us grew brighter, pushing back the shadows. With a final, desperate push, I shouted the last words of the incantation, pouring every ounce of strength and determination into the act. The board trembled violently, the planchette flying off its surface and shattering against the altar. There was a blinding flash of light, and the figure let out a final, anguished cry before dissolving into nothingness. The shadows fled, retreating into the depths of the forest, leaving only silence in their wake. The candles flickered and died, plunging us into darkness once more. But this time, it was a natural darkness, devoid of the malevolent presence that had haunted me for so long. As the night air settled around us, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over me. The pact was broken. The board was nothing more than a piece of wood, its power shattered, its hold on me severed. Sarah and I stood in the clearing, the weight of what we had accomplished slowly sinking in. We had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, our bond stronger for having endured the trials together. The journey back was quiet, the forest now a place of peace rather than fear. As we drove, I felt a sense of freedom that I hadn't known in months, a lightness in my soul that told me the nightmare was finally over. I knew I would never forget what had happened, the choices I had made, and the darkness I had confronted. But I also knew that I had the strength to face whatever came next, and with Sarah by my side, I could move forward into the future without fear. The board was gone, its power broken, but the experience had taught me a valuable lesson, that true wealth and power lay not in material gain, but in the bonds we forge with others, and the strength we find within ourselves to confront the darkness. And with that knowledge, I knew I could face whatever life had in store for me. I explored haunted sewage with the Ouija board. It was the worst decision of my life. Alright, so this is going to sound insane, but I need to get it off my chest. I've always been a bit of a thrill seeker. You know, the kind of person who gets a kick out of pushing the limits and exploring places I shouldn't. So when my buddy Jake hit me up one Friday night with the idea to check out the abandoned sewage tunnels on the edge of town, I was all in. He said it was supposed to be haunted, and he'd heard stories about strange rituals happening there. How could I say no to that kind of adventure? Jake and I had this weird dynamic where we fed off each other's energy. He'd been my partner in crime since high school, and we'd done all kinds of stupid shit together. Sneaking into abandoned buildings, late night ghost hunts, you name it, we'd probably done it. But this time, it felt different. There was a kind of heaviness in the air when we met up outside his house. He had this old, beat-up Ouija board under his arm, and a grin that said we were in for something wild. Before we left, we grabbed some essentials, flashlights, a couple of beers, and a pack of cigarettes. We weren't planning on staying long, just enough to get a good scare and a story to tell. The tunnels were about a 15-minute drive from Jake's place, on the outskirts where the town met the woods. As we drove, the conversation turned to the rumours about the tunnels. "Ever hear about the old sewer worker?" Jake asked, lighting a cigarette. The flame flickered in the darkness of the car, casting eerie shadows. "Yeah, some story about a guy who died down there, right?" I replied, trying to sound casual. "More than that, man. They say his spirit haunts the tunnels, looking for company. Some people have gone missing, and others have come out totally freaked, like they saw something they can't explain." I laughed it off, but there was an uneasy feeling in my gut. It's one thing to talk about ghosts, and another to seek them out in some dark, forgotten place. We reached the entrance to the tunnels, an old, rusted grate barely hanging onto its hinges. The area was overgrown, and the air smelled like damp earth and something else, something sour and rotten. It was the kind of place that screamed, "You shouldn't be here." We squeezed through the opening, and immediately the temperature dropped. Our flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing grimy walls lined with graffiti. The deeper we went, the more the world outside seemed to disappear. It was just us, the dark, and the echo of our footsteps. We found a spot that felt right, an open chamber where the tunnel split into 3 directions. Jake set the Ouija board on the ground, and we sat cross-legged around it. It was one of those moments where you realise how ridiculous you must look. 2 grown guys sitting in a filthy tunnel, trying to talk to ghosts. Jake placed his hands on the planchette and looked at me expectantly. I hesitated for a second, but joined him. "Is anyone here with us?" Jake asked, his voice bouncing off the walls. At first, nothing happened. Just silence and the distant sound of dripping water. I felt a bit of relief, to be honest. I didn't actually expect anything to happen. But then the planchette started to move. I looked at Jake, ready to call him out for messing with me, but the look on his face said he wasn't. It moved slowly, deliberately, spelling out, "Yes." "Who are you?" I asked, my voice cracking a little. The planchette moved again, spelling out a name, Sam. A chill ran down my spine. It was the name of the sewer worker, the one Jake mentioned. Part of me wanted to stop, to leave, but another part was morbidly curious. We continued, asking questions, how he died, why he was still here. The answers came slowly, fragmented, like pieces of a puzzle we couldn't quite put together. And then the atmosphere shifted. The air felt heavy, oppressive. Our flashlights flickered, and there was this sound, a low moan echoing through the tunnels. I laughed nervously, trying to shake off the fear, but Jake looked genuinely scared. "Maybe we should go," I suggested, my voice barely a whisper. But before we could pack up, the planchette started moving on its own, faster and more erratic. "Get out," it spelled over and over. I didn't need to be told twice. We grabbed the board and ran, the sound of our footsteps echoing like a heartbeat. I could swear I heard something following us, a shuffling sound just beyond the edge of the light. We didn't stop until we were out, gulping fresh air like it was the first we'd ever tasted. Back at Jake's car, we sat in stunned silence, trying to make sense of what happened. I looked at the Ouija board, now resting on the back seat, and felt a shiver run through me. We had come looking for a thrill, for a story to tell, but what we found was something else entirely. Something that wouldn't leave us alone. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that we left and never looked back. But that night was just the beginning. I didn't realize it at the time, but we had awakened something, and it wasn't going to let us go that easily. It's been a few days since that night in the tunnels, and I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something is off. I don't usually believe in this kind of stuff, but there's a lingering dread that I can't ignore. Things have been happening, strange things that I can't explain, and I feel like I'm being watched. The first night after we left the tunnels, I barely slept. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, convinced I could hear faint whispers just beyond the edge of consciousness. It was like the silence was alive, pulsing with an unseen presence. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the tunnels had freaked me out more than I cared to admit. But then the dreams started, each one more vivid and unsettling than the last. In them, I was back in the tunnels, but they were different, twisting and endless, leading me deeper into darkness. There was always something chasing me, something I couldn't see but could feel, breathing down my neck. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, heart pounding, convinced that I wasn't alone in my room. The following day, I decided to meet up with Jake. I needed to talk to him, to see if he was experiencing anything similar. We met at our usual spot, a rundown diner just outside town. Jake looked rough, like he hadn't slept in days. I could see the fear in his eyes, a reflection of my own unease. "Dude, I've been having these dreams," he confessed, rubbing his temples like he could erase the images. "I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong." I nodded, relieved that I wasn't alone in this. "Same here. It's like something followed us out of those tunnels." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our shared experiences hanging between us. The waitress brought our coffee, but neither of us touched it. Jake pulled out his phone and started scrolling through some forums, trying to find answers. "Look at this," he said, showing me a thread about hauntings and Ouija boards. There were stories about people who'd encountered malevolent spirits, entities that attached themselves to the living and fed off their fear. "We need to do something," Jake said, his voice shaky. "Maybe there's a way to get rid of it." We decided to visit a local psychic, a woman who ran a little shop filled with crystals and incense. Her name was Martha, and she looked like she'd seen everything under the sun. When we told her about the tunnels and the Ouija board, she listened intently, her expression growing more serious with every word. "You've awakened something," she said, her voice low and measured. "Spirits trapped in places like those are often restless, and some can be dangerous." She suggested a cleansing ritual, something to sever the connection between us and whatever was following us. I wasn't sure if I believed in that kind of thing, but at this point, I was willing to try anything. The ritual involved burning sage and using salt to form a protective circle. We did it at Jake's place, following Martha's instructions to the letter. As the sage smoke filled the room, I felt a strange sensation, like a pressure lifting off my chest. It was the first time in days that I felt some semblance of peace, but that peace didn't last. That night, the dreams returned, more vivid than ever. I was back in the tunnels, running through the dark corridors, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the endless maze. But this time, I wasn't alone. There was a figure at the edge of the light, just out of reach. I could see its eyes hollow and accusing, staring straight into my soul. I woke up, gasping for air, my heart racing. The room was dark, the shadows creeping in from every corner. And then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from the walls. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more insistent, like fingernails dragging across the plaster. Panic set in, and I fumbled for the light switch, flooding the room with harsh illumination. The sound stopped, leaving only the silence and my ragged breathing. I wanted to believe it was a rat or something equally mundane, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I called Jake, my voice trembling. "We need to do something more," I told him. "This isn't going away." We agreed to meet at the tunnels again, hoping to confront whatever it was that had attached itself to us. Maybe we could find a way to put it to rest, to end this nightmare once and for all. As I prepared to leave, I caught sight of the Ouija board sitting on my shelf, its wooden surface gleaming ominously in the morning light. A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to destroy it, to smash it into 1,000 pieces, but some part of me hesitated, as if it were already a part of me. The drive to the tunnels was tense, the weight of our decision heavy on my mind. This time, there was no excitement, no thrill, just a sense of impending doom, like we were stepping into the lion's den. When we arrived, the entrance loomed before us, dark and foreboding. We took a deep breath and stepped inside, the shadows closing in around us. I could feel the cold seeping into my bones, a reminder of the presence waiting below. This time, we weren't looking for a story. We were looking for a way out, a way to escape the terror that had taken hold of our lives. But deep down, I feared that we had already gone too far, and that the darkness we had awakened would never let us go. Returning to the tunnels was the last thing I wanted to do, but there was a sense of urgency that neither Jake nor I could ignore. We parked a bit further away this time, under the cover of trees, trying to keep out of sight. It was dusk, and the sky was awash of deep oranges and purples, giving way to the encroaching night. It felt fitting somehow, like we were descending into another world entirely. As we approached the rusted grate, I could feel the oppressive weight of the place pressing down on me. It was like the air itself was charged, humming with a sinister energy. Jake and I exchanged a glance, both of us unsure, but resolved. We had to face this head on. We slipped inside, the darkness swallowing us immediately. The beam of my flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the graffiti-covered walls that felt even more oppressive now than before. Each step echoed, a reminder of how alone we were down here. Alone, except for whatever else might be lurking in the shadows. We made our way back to the chamber where we'd first used the Ouija board. The air was colder, and there was a pungent smell, a mix of rot and something metallic. It was enough to make my stomach churn. Jake set down his backpack, pulling out the Ouija board with an air of determination that belied the fear I knew he felt. "What's the plan?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. It felt wrong to speak too loudly, as if doing so might wake something we weren't prepared to face. "We're going to talk to it, try to figure out what it wants. Maybe we can make it leave us alone," Jake replied, though he sounded far from convinced. We sat down, knees touching, the board between us. This time, there was no hesitation. Our fingers hovered over the planchette, and Jake asked the question we were both dreading. "Are you here with us?" The planchette moved almost immediately, sliding with a speed and force that made my heart skip. "Yes," it spelled, the letters stark and final. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause, a tension that built in the air before the planchette began to move again. "Stay." A shiver ran through me. The finality of that word felt like a prison sentence. Whatever this thing was, it didn't just want to scare us. It wanted to keep us here. Jake looked at me, his face pale in the dim light. "We need to find out who this is," he said, though it sounded more like a plea. "Who are you?" I asked, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. The response was slower this time, like the entity was taking its time, enjoying our discomfort. "Sam." I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Why are you still here, Sam?" There was a long pause, the silence thick and suffocating. Then The planchette started moving again, slowly spelling out its message. Trapped. A part of me felt a pang of sympathy. If this really was the spirit of that sewer worker, then maybe he was trapped, caught in some horrific loop. But another part of me, the part that remembered the nightmares and the scratching, knew that whatever this was, it wasn't human anymore. "What's trapping you?" Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. The board didn't answer. Instead, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping until we could see our breath fogging in the air. A low moan echoed through the tunnels. The sound of something primal and hungry. The planchette jerked violently, spelling out a new word. Hunger. My heart pounded in my chest. The sound was getting louder. A symphony of whispers and moans that seemed to come from all around us. I could feel it, pressing in from the shadows. A presence that was both angry and desperate. Jake looked at me, his eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice trembling. We scrambled to our feet, knocking the Ouija board aside as we grabbed our flashlights. The chamber seemed to close in on us, the shadows moving in ways that defied logic. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices overlapping, each more insistent than the last. As we turned to leave, I felt a tug on my jacket, like a cold hand trying to pull me back. Panic surged through me, and I yanked free, stumbling forward. Jake was already ahead, sprinting toward the exit, his flashlight beam bobbing wildly. We ran through the tunnels, the sound of our footsteps mingling with the relentless whispers that followed us. It was as if the tunnels themselves were alive, reshaping and shifting to keep us trapped. My lungs burned with the effort, and I could feel the presence drawing closer, a weight pressing down on me. When we finally burst out of the entrance, the cool night air hit us like a wave. We didn't stop running until we reached Jake's car, collapsing against it, panting and shaking. The world outside seemed brighter, more vibrant, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness we'd left behind. We sat there in silence, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away. I could still feel the chill in my bones, a reminder that whatever we'd encountered wasn't done with us. I knew we had to find a way to end this, to sever the connection once and for all. But as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the tunnels had become a part of us, that they wouldn't let us go so easily. And deep down, I wondered if we'd ever be free of the darkness we'd unleashed. We spent the next few days in a state of restless paranoia. Every noise felt ominous, every shadow a threat. Neither Jake nor I could shake the feeling that something was still with us, a constant presence lurking just out of sight. We needed answers, and we needed them fast. We decided to do some digging into the history of the tunnels, hoping to uncover more about Sam and what might have trapped him down there. Jake found an old article online about the sewage system and the workers who maintained it back in the day. It mentioned a man named Samuel Graves, a foreman who died under mysterious circumstances during a tunnel collapse in the late 1970s. Intrigued, we headed to the local library to see what else we could find. The place was nearly empty, the musty smell of old books filling the air as we combed through archives and newspapers. After hours of searching, we stumbled upon a report detailing the collapse. According to the article, Sam had been a well-respected worker, known for his dedication and no-nonsense attitude. But on the day of the collapse, something had gone terribly wrong. Witnesses claimed that they heard shouting from the depths of the tunnels, though no one could agree on what was said. When rescuers finally reached Sam, he was already gone, buried under tons of debris. But there was more. Rumours circulated about strange happenings before the accident. Unexplained noises, tools going missing, workers refusing to enter certain parts of the tunnels. Some believed the place was cursed, haunted by something dark and malevolent. As we read, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Sam's story, something the article wasn't saying. It was like a puzzle with missing pieces, and those pieces might be the key to freeing ourselves from whatever we'd awoken. I suggested we visit Sam's old house, which was still standing on the outskirts of town. It was a long shot, but maybe we'd find something to help us understand what was happening. Jake agreed, and the next morning, we set out to find the place. The house was a dilapidated old structure, its windows boarded up, and the yard overgrown with weeds. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. We pushed through the tangled grass to the front door, which creaked open under our touch, revealing a dark, dusty interior. Inside, the air was heavy with disuse, every step kicking up clouds of dust. We split up, searching for anything that might give us a clue about Sam and the tunnels. As I rummaged through the living room, I found a stack of old letters tied with twine, hidden in a drawer. The letters were addressed to Sam from his wife, written in neat cursive. They spoke of mundane things, household chores, neighbourhood gossip, but also hinted at a growing unease. In one letter, she mentioned Sam's increasing obsession with the tunnels, how he'd become distant, consumed by something he wouldn't talk about. But it was the last letter that caught my attention. It was different from the others, the handwriting shaky and desperate. She wrote about hearing voices in the night, whispers that seemed to come from the very walls, urging Sam to return to the tunnels. She begged him to quit his job, to leave before it was too late. Chills ran down my spine as I realised that whatever had haunted Sam might be the same thing haunting us. I called Jake over, showing him the letters, and we both knew we had to go back to the tunnels one last time. We needed to end this. Armed with the knowledge we'd gathered, we prepared for another trip. This time, we brought more than flashlights. A mix of skepticism and desperation fueled our resolve. I packed a bag with salt, candles, and a small mirror, hoping they might help us confront whatever was down there. As we drove back to the tunnels, an uneasy silence filled the car. We both knew this was a gamble, but it was the only chance we had to free ourselves from this nightmare. Back at the entrance, the familiar scent of decay and mould hit us as we slipped inside. The tunnels seemed even darker, the air thick with anticipation. We retraced our steps to the chamber where it all began, setting up the candles and mirror, forming a makeshift circle with the salt. I took a deep breath, my hands shaking as I placed the Ouija board in the centre. Jake and I knelt on either side, our fingers hovering over the planchette once more. "Sam!" I called out, my voice echoing down the corridors. "We know what happened to you. We know you're trapped." There was no immediate response, just the oppressive silence pressing in on us. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move. "Help!" it spelled. "How can we help you?" Jake asked, glancing at me, his eyes wide with fear. The planchette moved again, this time spelling out a new word, free. A gust of cold wind blew through the tunnels, snuffing out our candles and plunging us into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but the light refused to turn on. It was like the darkness was alive, crawling toward us, intent on swallowing us whole. In the pitch black, I could hear it, the whispering, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices overlapping, each more desperate and pleading than the last. They seemed to be coming from all around us, from the very walls themselves. "Sam, we're trying to help you," I shouted, my voice barely audible over the din. Then I felt it, a pressure on my chest, a weight that pushed me down to the cold, damp floor. I gasped for air, panic rising as I struggled against the unseen force. It felt like being buried alive, like the walls were closing in, intent on consuming me. Jake's voice cut through the darkness, calling my name, and I realized he was still with me, still fighting. I focused on his voice, using it as an anchor, a lifeline in the storm of chaos. "Remember the mirror," he shouted, his words piercing the veil of fear. The mirror. I scrambled in the darkness, my fingers finally finding its cool, smooth surface. I held it up, hoping it would reflect whatever was tormenting us, hoping it would somehow sever the connection. For a moment, everything went silent. The whispers stopped, the weight lifted, and I could breathe again. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, revealing Jake sitting across from me, his face pale and eyes wide. We looked around the chamber, expecting to see something, anything that would explain what had happened. But the tunnels were empty, the air still and quiet. "Did it work?" Jake asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know," I admitted, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. "But we need to get out of here." We grabbed our things and made our way back to the entrance. the oppressive atmosphere easing with each step. When we finally emerged into the night, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced since that first night. But even as we left, I couldn't shake the feeling that we hadn't truly escaped. Whatever had been down there, whatever we'd encountered, was still with us, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its chance to return. We drove home in silence, each of us lost in our thoughts. As the car rolled down the empty streets, I couldn't help but glance at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something staring back at me. I knew this wasn't over, not yet. We'd faced the darkness, but the darkness had seen us too. And deep down, I feared that it would come for us again. In the days that followed our last trip to the tunnels, life felt almost normal. The oppressive fear that had haunted us seemed to have lifted, and Jake and I both tried to move on. But in the back of my mind, there was a persistent nagging, a feeling that we hadn't really escaped. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still see the tunnels, the endless darkness reaching out like tendrils, trying to drag me back. It was inescapable, like a shadow that clung to me no matter how much light I shone on it. My dreams were still haunted by Sam's presence, a constant reminder that whatever we'd faced was far from gone. Jake seemed to be handling things better, but I could tell he was still shaken. He threw himself into work, hoping to drown out the memories with mindless tasks. But we both knew it was only a matter of time before the darkness caught up with us again. Then, one night, it happened. I was lying in bed, caught in that strange space between wakefulness and sleep, when I felt it, a cold hand brushing against my cheek, fingers curling around my throat. My eyes shot open, and I found myself staring into the darkness, the air heavy with a familiar chill. The whispers returned, louder than ever, filling the room with a chorus of desperate voices. It was like they were coming from all around me, from inside my head, echoing and overlapping in a maddening cacophony. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, trapped in a waking nightmare. Panicked, I reached for the flashlight on my nightstand, its beam cutting through the darkness. The voices stopped abruptly, replaced by an oppressive silence, but I could still feel it. That presence lingering just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for its chance to strike. I grabbed my phone, my fingers trembling as I called Jake. He answered after a few rings, his voice groggy and annoyed until he heard the fear in mine. "It's back," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "We didn't stop it. It's still with us." Jake cursed under his breath. "All right, meet me at my place. We'll figure something out." I threw on some clothes, grabbing the Ouija board and the mirror before heading out. The streets were eerily quiet as I drove to Jake's house, the oppressive weight of the night pressing down on me. Every shadow seemed to move, every flicker of light a reminder of the darkness that followed. When I arrived, Jake was already outside, pacing nervously. He looked as shaken as I felt, his eyes darting around like he expected something to leap out at him. We didn't waste any time, heading inside and locking the door behind us. "We need to end this, once and for all," Jake said, his voice tense. "We need to go back and confront whatever this is." I nodded, feeling a mix of dread and determination. We couldn't keep running, couldn't keep living in fear. It was time to face the darkness and put an end to this nightmare. Armed with our flashlights, the Ouija board, and the mirror, we set out for the tunnels one last time. The night was thick with anticipation, the air heavy with the promise of confrontation. We parked the car a distance away and walked the rest of the way, the moon casting an eerie glow over the path. As we approached the entrance, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The darkness seemed to pulse, alive and waiting, eager to swallow us whole. But there was no turning back now. We slipped inside, the air instantly colder, the silence deafening. The tunnels felt different this time, the darkness more oppressive, the shadows more eager to consume. We made our way back to the chamber, the familiar smell of decay and rot assaulting our senses. It was like stepping into another world, one where light didn't dare to tread. We set up the Ouija board and the mirror, forming a protective circle with the salt once more. There was no room for fear, only determination. This was it, the final confrontation. I placed my hands on the planchette, Jake doing the same, and we began. "Sam, we know you're here," I said, my voice steady. "We want to help you, but you need to let us go." The planchette moved quickly, more aggressively than before. "No," it spelled, the letters stark and uncompromising. "Why not?" Jake asked, his voice echoing down the tunnels. The response was immediate, the planchette moving with a force that made my fingers tingle. "Stay. Hunger." The whispers returned, a chorus of voices crying out in anguish. It was like a wave crashing over us, a sea of despair and longing. I could feel the darkness pressing in, a weight that threatened to crush us. "Sam, listen to me," I said, trying to project calm. "We know you're trapped, but you don't have to do this. We can help you move on." The air grew colder, the temperature plummeting until our breath fogged in the air. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if trying to drown out our words. But we held our ground, refusing to be cowed. Jake reached for the mirror, holding it up so that the darkness was reflected back on itself. For a moment, everything went silent, the oppressive weight lifting as the mirror caught the light. And then we saw it, a figure, barely visible, standing at the edge of the circle. It was Sam, or what was left of him. His eyes hollow and desperate, he stared at us, his face twisted in a mixture of anger and longing. "Let us help you," I repeated, my voice steady. "Let us free you from this." Sam's figure wavered, the shadows shifting around him. The whispers softened, fading into the background like a distant echo. For a moment it seemed like he might listen, that we might finally reach him. But then the darkness surged, a wave of anger and despair crashing over us. The candles flickered, the shadows closing in, and Sam's figure dissolved into the blackness. The planchette jerked violently, spelling out one final message. "Mine." The weight of the words hit me like a physical blow. Whatever this was, it wasn't just Sam. It was something older, something darker, and it wasn't going to let us go without a fight. We couldn't stay any longer. The darkness was closing in, the whispers rising to a deafening crescendo. We grabbed the Ouija board and the mirror, stumbling back toward the entrance, the shadows nipping at our heels. As we emerged into the night, I felt a surge of relief, the weight lifting as the moonlight bathed us in its glow. But I knew this wasn't over. Whatever we'd faced down there was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next chance. Jake and I stood in silence, catching our breath, the reality of our situation sinking in. We hadn't freed Sam, hadn't banished the darkness, but we'd survived, and for now, that was enough. As we drove away, I couldn't help but glance at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see Sam's hollow eyes staring back at me. But the road was empty, the night calm and still. For now, we were free. But deep down, I knew the darkness wasn't done with us yet. It would return, and when it did, we'd be ready. My dead uncle tried to curse me with the Ouija board. "Hey Reddit, this is one of those things you hear about but never expect to happen to you. I've had a pretty mundane life, but everything turned upside down last year after my uncle died. He and my mum weren't exactly close. In fact, they hated each other, but I never thought he'd go this far. To give you some background, my family is a bit of a mess. My grandpa was a rich old man who made his fortune investing in land back when it was dirt cheap. By the time he passed, his estate was worth a ton, and when the will was read, it turned out he left everything to my mum. My uncle, Roger, was pissed. You'd think they'd split it, but Grandpa knew Roger was a screw-up, always getting into shady business and blowing money like it was his job. Roger and Mum had this sibling rivalry that would put any TV drama to shame. Mum once told me that Grandpa had bailed Roger out of jail more times than she could count, and had finally had enough. So all the money and property went to her, which drove Roger insane. We didn't hear much from him after that, except for the occasional drunken rant at family gatherings. Fast forward to last year, Roger was found dead in his crappy apartment. Heart attack. At first, I felt bad for him. I mean, despite all his faults, he was family. But that sympathy went straight out the window when I discovered what he had planned for me. I found out about the curse through my cousin Liz. She and I were always close despite the family drama. Liz called me a week after Roger's funeral, and she sounded scared. She told me she found something in her dad's stuff that I needed to see. I was curious, but not exactly eager to dive into Roger's world of conspiracy theories and hoarded junk. When I got to Liz's house, she looked like she hadn't slept in days. She handed me an old, worn-out notebook that had private scrawled across the cover in shaky handwriting. Inside, it was full of ramblings about curses, revenge, and, most chillingly, me. Roger had been obsessed with the idea that my mum's good fortune was my fault somehow, like I had inherited some kind of cosmic luck that should have been his. The notebook detailed how he planned to use a Ouija board to transfer a curse onto me, to ruin my life the way he felt his had been ruined. It was insane, but what really got under my skin was how he wrote about it. Like he was dead serious and believed this was his last shot at some twisted justice. I tried to laugh it off, thinking it was just the ramblings of a bitter old man, but Liz wouldn't let it go. She said she found the board in his closet, and the plan was already in motion. To say I was skeptical is an understatement. I mean, come on, curses and Ouija boards? But Liz was insistent, and the more she talked, the more a pit of anxiety settled in my stomach. She showed me the board, a cheap, dusty thing you'd find at a yard sale. There was something off about it, though. The letters were scratched and faded, like it had been used for something way more sinister than a spooky game at a sleepover. Liz said she tried to get rid of it, but every time she did, it ended up back in her room. I didn't believe her until we tried burning it together. We doused it in lighter fluid and set it ablaze, but the fire died out almost instantly, leaving the board untouched. I remember standing there staring at it, feeling this creeping dread crawling up my spine. That's when I knew, as crazy as it sounded, that we were dealing with something far beyond my understanding. Over the next few weeks, things started to happen. Little at first, like finding the lights on when I was sure I'd turned them off. Then it got worse. Objects in my house moved on their own. I'd hear footsteps at night, but there'd be no one there. One night, I woke up to find every door and window in my house wide open. It was freezing outside, but my living room felt like a furnace. And in the middle of the room was the Ouija board, the planchette moving on its own. My heart nearly stopped as I watched it slide across the board, spelling out words that seared themselves into my brain. Payback, it spelled. Roger. Curse. Each word felt like a punch to the gut, and I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I don't remember much after that, just a sense of overwhelming dread. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't go to my mum with this. She'd think I was crazy, so I turned to the internet, hoping to find a way to break whatever curse Roger had tried to put on me. That's how I ended up here, hoping someone might have a clue about what to do next. I can feel it getting worse, like something dark is hovering over me, waiting to strike. Anyway, that's part one of my story. I'll keep you posted on what happens next, but if anyone's got advice, I'm all ears. I'm getting desperate here. Stay safe out there, folks. You never know when a ghost from your past might come back to haunt you. After that night with the Ouija board, sleep became a rare commodity. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle in the dark, felt like Roger whispering from the shadows. I didn't want to admit it, but I was scared out of my mind. Liz was the only person I trusted, and she was just as freaked out as I was. We decided we needed more answers. I spent hours on Reddit threads and online forums, sifting through paranormal subreddits and occult websites. It was all the same advice. Close the portal, burn the board, or get a priest. I'd already tried the first two, and the third option felt way out of my comfort zone. Liz had a better idea. She remembered an old friend of her dad's, a guy named Earl, who dabbled in the occult. Earl was the kind of person who collected weird stuff, tarot cards, crystals, old books with titles you couldn't pronounce. Liz figured if anyone could help, it'd be him. Earl's house was as creepy as you'd expect. It was on the outskirts of town, an old Victorian that looked like it hadn't been maintained in decades. We knocked and the door creaked open to reveal a wiry man with long, grey hair and eyes that seemed to peer right through you. He welcomed us in with a voice as raspy as gravel and led us to a cluttered living room filled with dusty antiques and strange symbols etched into the walls. We explained the situation, showing him the Ouija board. Earl studied it with a frown, muttering to himself. After what felt like an eternity, he looked up, his face serious. "This board's been used in some dark stuff. It's got energy clinging to it. Bad energy." His words sent a shiver down my spine. Earl told us the board was a conduit, a way for Roger to channel his resentment and anger into the world of the living. The more I interacted with it, the more power it gave to whatever curse Roger had set in motion. He warned us that breaking the connection wouldn't be easy, but that there was a ritual we could try. That night, back at my place, we set up for the ritual. Earl had given us a list of ingredients: salt, candles, sage, and a piece of personal belonging from Roger. Liz had brought one of her dad's old shirts. As I arranged the items, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were in way over our heads. We sat in a circle around the board, the room dimly lit by flickering candles. Earl had instructed us to chant specific words while burning sage, a process that seemed both archaic and surreal. As we began, I could feel the air shift around us, a heavy stillness that pressed down like a weight on my chest. Halfway through the ritual, things started happening. The flames on the candles flickered wildly, casting distorted shadows across the walls. The temperature dropped sharply, our breath visible in the cold. Then, the board itself began to tremble, the planchette skidding violently across its surface. Liz squeezed my hand, eyes wide with fear, as the planchette spelled out more words. Stop, revenge, mine. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I forced myself to keep chanting, even as my voice cracked with terror. Suddenly, the candles blew out, plunging the room into darkness. I could feel the presence of something else in the room, an overwhelming sense of malevolence that made my skin crawl. And then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The room was silent, the only sound our ragged breathing. When we turned the lights back on, the board lay still, the planchette unmoving. We'd done it, or so we thought. Exhausted, Liz and I decided to crash at my place, too afraid to go anywhere else. We stayed up late, jumping at every little noise, but eventually we drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next morning, I woke up to find Liz gone. Panic surged through me until I found her in the kitchen, making coffee. She looked like she hadn't slept at all, dark circles under her eyes. "Did you hear that last night?" she asked, her voice shaky. Confused, I shook my head. She explained that she'd heard whispers, a low murmur that grew louder until it was a cacophony of angry voices. It felt like it was coming from inside her head, she said, and it had only stopped just before dawn. I didn't know what to say, and the thought of it left me with a growing sense of dread. Things got worse from there. We both started having nightmares, vivid, disturbing dreams where Roger appeared, always saying the same thing. "You can't escape." It felt like he was watching us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Every day felt like a countdown, and I had no idea what would happen when the clock hit 0. It became a struggle to keep up with work and daily life. I was on edge all the time, snapping at co-workers and avoiding friends. Liz had it even worse. She was getting sick constantly, her skin pale and her hair falling out in clumps. We both knew this wasn't normal, but we were too afraid to ask for help. Despite everything, we refused to give up. We had to break this curse before it consumed us both. The only problem was, we had no idea how. Earl had said the ritual might not be enough, and that if it didn't work, we'd need to find a stronger connection to Roger. Whatever that meant, it sounded like a death sentence. That's where we left off. We're planning to meet up again and figure out our next move. I'm not sure what's going to happen, but we can't keep living like this. I'll update you all soon with part 3. Hopefully, we'll have a better idea of what to do by then. Until then, if anyone's got any other suggestions, we're all ears. It feels like we're running out of time, and the darkness is closing in fast. Things started spiraling after that night. The air in my apartment felt heavy, like it was soaked in Roger's lingering malice. Liz and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were constantly being watched, even when we were alone. Every creak of the floor, every whisper of wind outside, felt like an echo of something lurking just out of sight. One morning, after another night of restless sleep, I woke up to find strange markings on my arms. They looked like scratches, angry red lines etched into my skin. They didn't hurt, but the sight of them filled me with a deep sense of unease. When I showed Liz, she paled and lifted her sleeves to reveal identical marks on her arms. That's when we knew we couldn't wait any longer. Earl had warned us that things could escalate, but this was beyond anything we had imagined. We decided to visit him again, desperate for answers. When we arrived at Earl's place, the atmosphere was tense. He greeted us at the door with a worried expression, ushering us inside quickly. As soon as we explained what was happening, he looked grim. "It's getting stronger," he said, his voice low. "Whatever your uncle unleashed, it's feeding off your fear." Earl explained that our connection to Roger, both through blood and through the curse, was amplifying his presence. The only way to break it completely was to sever the link between us and him. He suggested a more dangerous ritual, one that involved confronting Roger's spirit directly. I didn't want to do it. The thought of facing Roger, even as a ghost, filled me with dread. But Earl was insistent. "If you don't face him, he'll keep growing stronger. You have to make him let go." We agreed to try, though every part of me screamed that it was a bad idea. Earl gave us a list of things we needed: a mirror, candles, and an item that belonged to Roger. A stronger link than the shirt we'd used before. Liz remembered a pocket watch that her dad always carried, and we decided that would have to do. That night, we set up the ritual in my living room. We placed the mirror in the center, surrounded by candles, and set the pocket watch in front of it. The room felt cold and oppressive, like we were standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous. Earl had instructed us to gaze into the mirror and call out to Roger, demanding he show himself. My heart pounded as we began, the flickering candlelight casting eerie shadows on the walls. I could feel a presence in the room, a prickling sensation at the back of my neck. As we called out to Roger, the mirror began to fog over, a swirling mist obscuring our reflections. I held my breath, waiting, and then I saw him. His face emerged from the mist, gaunt and twisted with rage. It was Roger, but not the way I remembered him. This version of him was monstrous, his eyes burning with a hatred that chilled me to the bone. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. His reflection sneered. "You took everything from me," he spat, his voice a harsh whisper that echoed in the room. "Your mother stole my birthright, and you're just a constant reminder of what I lost." I could feel his anger, a boiling rage that seemed to seep through the mirror and claw at my insides. Liz gripped my arm, her nails digging into my skin as she struggled to stay calm. "We didn't take anything," Liz said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "You did this to yourself." Roger's face twisted with fury, and the mist in the mirror churned violently. "You'll never be rid of me," he growled. "I'll drag you both down with me." Desperation surged through me. I knew we had to end this now, or be consumed by his hatred. Earl had told us to be firm, to show no fear. I took a deep breath, focusing on the anger that had been building inside me since this nightmare began. "You have no power over us," I said, forcing the words out with as much conviction as I could muster. "You're dead, Roger. You can't hurt us anymore." The air in the room crackled with tension, the candles flickering wildly. For a moment, it felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Then, the mirror cracked, a jagged line splitting Roger's reflection in half. The mist dissipated, and the room was silent once more. Liz and I stared at the mirror, hardly daring to believe it was over. We cleaned up in silence, neither of us wanting to break the fragile peace that had settled over the room. It felt like a weight had been lifted, the oppressive atmosphere slowly fading away. Earl called the next day to check on us. He sounded relieved when we told him what happened, though he warned us to remain cautious. "These things can linger," he said, "but you should be free of the worst of it now." Liz and I tried to get back to normal, though the experience left us both changed. We talked about it often, trying to make sense of what had happened and how we could move on. There are still nights when I wake up feeling like someone's watching me, but the feeling fades quickly. The scratches on my arms have healed, leaving faint scars that serve as a reminder of what we went through. Despite everything, I feel stronger, more in control of my life. Liz and I are closer than ever, bound by the ordeal we faced together. We're determined to live our lives without fear, no matter what shadows might linger from the past. That's where we stand for now. I'll update with part 4 if anything else happens, but I'm hoping we can finally put this chapter behind us. Just when I thought life was returning to some semblance of normalcy, I started noticing strange things happening again. It began subtly, with little things I could almost chalk up to my imagination, lights flickering or doors creaking open on their own. But soon enough, it became clear that something was very wrong. One night, I was lying in bed trying to fall asleep when I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window. My room is on the 2nd floor, and there's no tree or anything nearby that could have caused it. I brushed it off, but then it happened again the next night, and the one after that. The tapping evolved into whispers, low and unintelligible, like someone was trying to speak to me from the other side of a thick wall. I could never make out the words, but I could feel the malice behind them, a sinister intent that made my skin crawl. It was like Roger was back, clawing his way into my life once more. I didn't want to panic Liz. She was finally starting to seem like her old self again, and I didn't want to drag her back into this nightmare unless I was sure. But deep down, I knew I needed her help. I couldn't face this alone. The breaking point came when I saw Roger's face in my bathroom mirror. It was just a fleeting glimpse as I walked past, but it was unmistakable. His eyes burning with that same hatred, the same twisted expression. It felt like my heart stopped, and all I could do was stand there, frozen, until the image faded. The next morning, I called Liz, trying to sound casual, but she picked up on the tension in my voice immediately. "It's happening again, isn't it?" she asked. I didn't even have to answer. She just knew. We decided to meet at a coffee shop to talk things over. It was one of those dreary, grey days where the sky seemed to press down, adding to the oppressive weight in my chest. Liz looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes telling me that she, too, had been experiencing something similar. "Earl warned us it could linger," she said, stirring her coffee absently. "But this feels different." I nodded, feeling a shiver run through me. It's like he's stronger now, somehow, like the ritual only made him angrier. Liz suggested we talk to Earl again, but we both knew he might not have all the answers. It was up to us to find a way to end this for good. We brainstormed, flipping through the mental catalogue of everything we'd read and tried, looking for any clue or loose end we might have missed. That's when Liz had an idea. What if we've been thinking about this the wrong way? We've been trying to fight Roger, but what if we need to find a way to let him go? The idea made sense in a strange way. Roger had spent his life consumed by jealousy and anger. Maybe he was clinging to this world because he couldn't let go of his grudges. We needed to find a way to help him move on, to release whatever held him here. We decided to hold a séance, something neither of us had ever considered before. It felt risky, like inviting trouble, but it also felt like our best shot at getting closure. Earl was reluctant to get involved again, but he agreed to supervise from a distance, providing guidance on how to conduct it safely. We set up the séance at Liz's place, hoping the change of environment would help. The room was dimly lit with candles, the atmosphere tense but charged with determination. We gathered items that had belonged to Roger, laying them out as a focus for the session. As we sat in silence, hands joined, I felt a chill sweep through the room, an unmistakable presence that made my heart race. We called out to Roger, asking him to come forward, to communicate with us one last time. At first, There was nothing but the flickering of candlelight and the sound of our breathing. Then, a faint whisper filled the air, growing stronger until we could make out words. "Why?" the voice hissed, echoing around us. It was Roger, his voice laced with bitterness and confusion. "We're here to help you move on," Liz said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear I knew she felt. There was a long pause, the air crackling with tension. "They took everything," Roger's voice said, and this time it was laced with an almost childlike sadness. "No one took anything," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "You were trapped in your own anger. It's time to let go, Roger." The air grew colder, and I felt a pressure in my chest, like something was trying to push its way through. The candles flickered violently, and then there was a sudden, piercing sound, a cry of anguish that reverberated through the room, making the hairs on my neck stand on end. Just as suddenly, it stopped, and the air felt lighter, the oppressive atmosphere lifting. We waited, hearts pounding, but there were no more whispers, no more tapping. It was as if a weight had been lifted, a door finally closed. After a long silence, Liz and I looked at each other, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over us. We'd done it. We'd actually done it. We stayed up late into the night, talking through everything, trying to process the events that had brought us to this moment. In the days that followed, the atmosphere continued to lighten. I no longer felt Roger's presence lurking in the shadows, and the marks on my arms faded completely. Liz seemed healthier, her energy returning as the darkness receded from our lives. It wasn't easy to move on, but we did our best to put the past behind us. We still talk about Roger sometimes, hoping that he's finally found the peace that eluded him in life. And as for me, I've learned to appreciate the normalcy of everyday life, cherishing the quiet moments that I once took for granted. But even now, I sometimes catch myself listening for the faintest whisper in the wind, wondering if the past is ever truly gone. A few months passed, and life gradually settled back into a routine. Liz and I both threw ourselves into work and school, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy. The haunting memories of Roger slowly faded into the background, and we finally began to believe that the nightmare was over. But just when I thought we were free, something happened that shattered my newfound peace. It was a Friday evening, and I was home alone, flipping through the TV channels with little interest. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging the room into darkness. I sighed, figuring it was just another power outage. They were common in our neighborhood, especially during storm season. Grabbing my phone, I flicked on the flashlight and went to check the fuse box. As I approached it, I noticed a strange sensation, like the air was charged with static electricity. My skin prickled with an all too familiar dread. Reluctantly, I turned around, the beam of my flashlight sweeping across the room. That's when I saw it, a message scratched into the wall above the mantelpiece. It hadn't been there before, and my heart skipped a beat as I read the words. Not over. Panic surged through me, my mind racing with possibilities. Had we failed to break the connection after all? Was Roger still clinging on, waiting for the right moment to strike again? I called Liz, my hands trembling as I dialed her number. She picked up almost immediately, her voice tight with concern when she heard the fear in mine. I explained what had happened, and she insisted on coming over right away. While I waited for her, I sat in the darkened living room, trying to make sense of it all. The shadows seemed to close in around me, whispering reminders of the horrors we'd faced. I felt a cold breeze brush past, and for a split second, I thought I heard Roger's voice again, low and mocking. When Liz arrived, she was armed with everything she could think of to combat the supernatural. A hastily gathered collection of sage, candles, and a small book of prayers Earl had given her as a precaution. Together, we set up a circle in the living room, determined to end this once and for all. As we began to recite the prayers, a wind howled through the house, rattling the windows and extinguishing the candles. But we pressed on, our voices growing louder, fueled by the fear that if we didn't succeed now, we might never get another chance. I felt a pressure building in the room, an unseen force that seemed to push against us. The air was thick with tension, and my heart pounded in my chest. It was as if the house itself was alive, breathing with the malice of a spirit that refused to rest. Finally, as our voices reached a crescendo, there was a deafening crack, like thunder, and then silence. The oppressive weight lifted, and a sense of calm settled over us. It felt different this time, more final, like a door had truly been closed. In the aftermath, Liz and I sat on the floor, exhausted but relieved. We stayed like that for a long time, neither of us speaking, just savouring the quiet that had eluded us for so long. In the weeks that followed, there were no more signs, no whispers in the dark. The scratches on the wall faded, and the house felt like home again, not a battleground for ghosts. Liz and I made a pact to keep an eye on each other, to stay connected no matter what. We knew that the experiences we'd shared had bound us in ways that only we could understand. And though the scars of the ordeal might never fully heal, we'd come out stronger on the other side. Looking back, it's hard to believe everything that happened. I've often wondered if it was all some elaborate trick of the mind, or if Roger really was as powerful in death as he wanted to be. But in the end, it doesn't really matter. What matters is that we survived, and that we were able to reclaim our lives from the shadow of his malice. I've learned to appreciate the small joys in life, the moments of peace that once seemed so insignificant. And every now and then, when I catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, I remind myself that the past is behind us and we have the power to shape our own futures. That's the end of this chapter, at least for now. If I've learned anything from this, it's that life is unpredictable, and the past has a way of creeping back when you least expect it. But whatever comes next, I know we'll face it head on, unafraid and unyielding. Thanks for listening to my story. Stay safe out there, and remember, you never really know what's lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to step into the light.